The Galactic Council chambers were a marvel of interstellar design, massive, domed, and built with alloys mined from collapsed neutron stars. Delegates from over 100 species convened there, their forms as diverse as their cultures, crystalline beings refracting starlight through their facets, sentient gas clouds confined to containment fields, insectoid strategists, and silicon-based giants that hadn't known fear in millennia. Amid them sat a lone human, Ambassador Elias Kerr. Quiet, composed, human in every possible sense. Flesh, blood, eyes that had seen both space and suffering. He didn't speak much. He didn't need to. The Council had already made up its mind. The human species lacks the psychological stability for galactic defense coordination, declared High Warlord Sithrak of the Dralcor Dominion, his scales rippling with disdain. Their entire history reeks of fear, fear of war, fear of power, fear of themselves. They cower behind diplomacy and words. When pressed, they falter. Murmurs of agreement followed. The Krell, the Siltari, even the historically neutral Zelek delegate nodded. Data streams played above the center table, projecting human behavioral analyses, emotional instability, internal strife, inconsistent alliances. Earth's entry into the galactic community had raised more questions than confidence. Elias didn't flinch. He studied the holograms with the same patience he'd shown since arriving months ago. The Council assumed it was humility. They thought his silence was submission. We offered them FTL lanes, military escorts, trade routes, continued Sithrak. And what do? Decline joint training, avoid Council maneuvers, question our defense protocols. Do they expect kindness to protect them? The delegate from the Vizari, a psychic race, interjected. They are creatures of empathy, not strategy. They seek peace in a galaxy ruled by force. That is admirable, but impractical. The room fell into a contemplative hush. Then came the vote. A motion to restrict humanity's involvement in future military operations. No command posts. No fleet control. Advisory roles only. Minimal weapons access. Protection, not partnership. As hands, claws, tendrils, and pseudopods cast their votes, Elias stood. Not tall, not commanding, but deliberate. He didn't ask to speak. He didn't need permission. When he spoke, the room quieted, not out of respect, but confusion. Humans rarely interrupted proceedings. You say we're afraid of war, he began, voice level. That's correct. Some delegates exchanged smug glances. We are, he continued. Terrified, even. We've seen what war does to bodies, to minds, to generations. We remember the names of cities reduced to ash. We carry the scars of wars so vast we had to invent new languages to explain the horrors. A flicker of discomfort moved across the chamber. Words alone shouldn't have that weight, but Elias's tone made them feel heavier than any weapon. You think fear makes us weak. You believe it renders us unfit for leadership. But fear isn't cowardice. Fear is memory. Fear is restraint. Fear is knowing exactly what we're capable of and choosing not to unleash it. Sithrak scoffed. Empty rhetoric. Emotionally charged but hollow. Elias looked him in the eye. How many wars have the Dralcor fought in the last 1,000 years? 17. How many did you win? All of them. Elias nodded. Efficient. Predictable enemies. Tactical superiority. Wars where the outcome was known before the first shot. Sithrak's jaw twitched. We fought hundreds, Elias said. Against ourselves. Against chaos. Against extinction. Not wars of conquest, but wars of survival. We didn't fight because we were stronger, we fought because surrender meant erasure. He paused. When humans go to war, it's never clean. Never simple. Our enemies don't walk away, they don't walk at all. We win ugly. We endure. And when it's over, we bury our dead and carry on. That's not something to boast about. That's something to fear. The room had grown unnervingly silent. You misunderstand us because we choose diplomacy first, Elias said. We send words before weapons. You think that means we have none. But peace isn't our weakness, it's our warning. We don't avoid war because we can't fight. We avoid it because we know exactly what it costs. He stepped back, hands behind his back, gaze unwavering. A delegate from the Dari Confederacy, long skeptical of humanity, broke the silence. Then prove it. What would humanity do if faced with a war we refuse to fight? Elias's expression didn't change. We prepare for every war as if we'll lose everything. And when we decide to fight, we do it knowing it may be the last thing we ever do. That's how we win. The council recessed without resolution. The vote was tabled. The Dralcor stormed out, their pride bruised. Most others left in silence, disturbed not by aggression, but by absence of it. In the emptying chamber, the Zelek delegate approached Elias. The Zelek spoke rarely, but when they did, their words were weighed like precious metals. We studied your history, the alien said. You've buried more of your own than we've lost in total. Elias nodded once. Then why not flaunt it? The Zelek asked. Why hide your strength? Elias turned to leave. Because the moment you see us as warriors, is the moment we become them again. No grandstanding. No threats. No display of firepower. Just truth. Cold, undressed, and uncomfortable. The kind of truth that doesn't shout, it waits. Like a knife sheathed until the next fool reaches for it. That day, the Galactic Council didn't fear Earth's weapons. They began to fear its silence. They saw Earth as peaceful because they only saw the surface. What the Council didn't grasp was that humanity's obsession with peace wasn't a sign of weakness. It was a scar that had hardened into instinct. The archives available to alien analysts were curated, sanitized. Documentaries, speeches, statistics, they showed a people who had learned diplomacy, established global governance, formed humanitarian efforts. But none of that existed in a vacuum. It was all built on the bones of civilizations that had bled themselves dry. Before humans looked to the stars, they had turned their weapons inward. Entire continents had been forged through conquest and genocide. Every inch of progress had been paid in pain. They didn't just survive war, they evolved through it. World War I introduced mechanized killing. Trench warfare, chemical weapons, attrition through misery. Millions died for inches of dirt. And when it ended, it wasn't out of enlightenment, it was exhaustion. Barely a generation passed before World War II engulfed the planet in a fury even worse. 70 million dead. Cities burned to cinders. Atrocities committed on scales that defied comprehension. Mankind saw the depths of its own madness and, instead of collapsing, stood up again. Then came the nuclear age. For the first time, humanity developed weapons that could erase its entire species in a single day. And they lived with that shadow. For decades, children grew up doing nuclear drills, politicians played brinkmanship, and civilizations operated with fingers hovering over extinction. The Cold War wasn't cold, it was just quiet. The tension etched itself into human psychology. Survive, adapt, endure. Civil wars, proxy conflicts, insurrections, colonial upheavals. There were no centuries of peace, no resting eras. Even during humanity's golden ages, someone somewhere was at war. Technology advanced because of it. Medical science progressed out of necessity to treat wounded soldiers. Satellites launched for reconnaissance later became tools of communication. Every leap forward came with blood in its gears. Other species viewed war as a disruption to order. For humans, it was the crucible of progress. Pain wasn't just endured, it was studied, catalogued, weaponized, and ultimately transformed into knowledge. The Council's mistake wasn't underestimating humanity's strength. It was misunderstanding the nature of that strength. The Dralcor won wars through superior force. The Vizari manipulated outcomes through psychic intimidation. But humanity didn't rely on dominance or power. Their greatest weapon was desperation refined into ingenuity. No other species had created guerrilla warfare with such effectiveness. No other race had weaponized environment, psychology, and improvisation in equal measure. A human army could be starving, outnumbered, undersupplied, and still win. Not because of superiority, but because surrender was simply not an acceptable outcome. They rewrote rules mid-conflict. They broke their own bones to reset them stronger. Their tactics were unpredictable because they didn't fear failure the way others did. When something didn't work, they changed it. Adaptation wasn't a trait, it was their core identity. This was a species that had lived with the idea of annihilation and still built art. They knew what it meant to lose entire generations and still teach their children how to love. They mastered the concept of never again, without ever believing it would hold. One alien historian described Earth's war records as a library built in a cemetery. It was accurate. Human conflict didn't end, it just evolved. Every peace treaty was a pause. Every alliance had been born of hard choices. And each time they had to rebuild, they did so faster than before, more efficient, more determined. Their greatest victories didn't lie in conquest, but in how they kept rebuilding in defiance of devastation. Berlin leveled, then reborn. Hiroshima erased, then illuminated. Nations that once swore destruction now shared trade, culture, and research. Enemies became allies, not because of some inherent moral superiority, but because humans had learned through agony that peace was more profitable than pride. That knowledge came at a cost that most species would find intolerable. The Council looked at Earth's pacifist policies and assumed it was a gentle world. They saw a species trying to avoid galactic confrontation and took it as weakness. They never considered it was restraint, earned, conscious, and volatile. Every soldier humanity produced carried centuries of history in their blood. Training wasn't just technical, it was philosophical. Soldiers were taught what it meant to kill, and more importantly, what it meant to choose not to. Other species taught their warriors to dominate. Humans taught theirs to endure, to think, to remember. Fear wasn't a flaw. It was data. A human soldier who feared death didn't hesitate. They moved smarter, watched more carefully, fought harder to survive. Fear kept them alive because they never saw it as failure, but as focus. The Council couldn't comprehend the human doctrine of proportional response. To them, if humanity had strength, why not flaunt it? Why speak softly when you could roar? What they missed was that humanity didn't roar until it was too late to stop them. Throughout Earth's history, their greatest champions weren't warlords, they were survivors. Leaders who endured suffering and chose diplomacy not because they were weak, but because they knew the alternative. Their caution wasn't cowardice. It was memory. Even their fiction reflected this. Tales of war were everywhere in human media, not to glorify, but to warn. Films, books, art, they all circled the same theme: what happens when war becomes normalized. And yet, every generation produced stories of sacrifice, of redemption through conflict, of individuals who found humanity in the middle of hell. This was not a culture that fled from violence out of fear. It was one that had been shaped by violence and chose, deliberately, to chain the monster inside. The Council had reviewed thousands of hours of human footage, battles, speeches, memorials. They thought they understood. But a clip from a soldier's interview near the end of Earth's last major conflict said more than all the analysis ever could. He was asked why he kept fighting after losing everything. He said, "Because someone has to live long enough to make sure this never happens again." That was humanity in its purest form. Not heroic. Not noble. Just relentless in the pursuit of survival with meaning. The Council saw peace as a default state. For Earth, peace was a constant, conscious struggle against instincts sharpened by centuries of blood. The truth was simple. Humanity didn't fear war because it was alien to them. They feared it because they understood it too well. And the galaxy, in assuming otherwise, had unknowingly built its peace atop a powder keg. The attack came without warning. A Council-aligned outpost on the edge of the Varnak cluster was hit in the early hours of a standard galactic cycle. The aggressors, an alliance of fringe species and exiled war clans calling themselves the Core Dominion, struck fast, without formal declaration or demand. The assault wasn't a skirmish. It was a statement. The outpost broadcast a distress call. Council fleets were stationed light years away, caught in bureaucratic rotations. Protocol dictated deliberation, analysis, coordinated response. Humanity didn't wait. A Terran colony, established less than 6 months prior, sat just 2 systems away. No military support was assigned. It was meant to be peaceful expansion. Civilian scientists, engineers, families. When the distress signal reached them, they made a decision the Council would later describe as reckless. The humans called it necessary. Within 2 hours, the colony's governor invoked an old Earth directive, autonomous defensive action. Civilian ships were reconfigured. Orbital defense platforms, considered dormant, were rearmed. Retired personnel reactivated their commissions. A message was sent to the Council, not asking for permission, but notifying them. We're responding. Do not interfere. What followed was not a battle. It was a surgical dismantling of the core assault wing. The Council watched through long-range surveillance arrays. What they expected was chaos. Uncoordinated resistance. Civilian losses. Panic. Instead, they saw precision. Human ships moved with an efficiency that suggested years of planning. They deployed electronic interference that blinded core sensors. Frigates laid decoy patterns, then disappeared into asteroid fields only to strike from flanks the enemy thought secured. Boarding parties used breaching pods with manual override systems, obsolete to most Council forces, but perfect for bypassing automated defenses. The Corps had numbers. They had firepower. What they didn't have was the willingness to absorb damage, adapt, and strike again. Human forces didn't rely on overwhelming strength. They relied on layered tactics, overlapping fields of fire, fallback points, trap corridors. Every loss inflicted on them was answered with double precision. Captured Corps commanders later admitted they believed humans would sue for peace once civilian structures were threatened. But no such negotiation ever came. Human response was immediate, not emotional. Cold, direct, relentless. Council analysts scrambled to understand. The humans had no central fleet command nearby. No reinforcements. No formal declaration. Yet everything operated like a cohesive doctrine. It turned out humanity had contingency protocols embedded in every colonization directive. Not just for environmental hazards or civil disorder, but full-scale warfare. They had anticipated betrayal, even if they hoped it wouldn't happen. And when it did, they followed pre-written procedures, ones no alien race had ever considered necessary. By the time the Council assembled a response fleet, the fighting was over. The core fleet was shattered. Not just defeated, scattered across the sector, routed. Their supply lines cut, command structure exposed, rear positions overrun. When Council ships entered the system, they found human vessels already conducting post-combat assessments. Civilian casualties were minimal. Infrastructure damage was contained. Enemy survivors were being held under strict compliance with interstellar wartime codes. The operation had been brutal, but clean. No war crimes. No excess. And that, more than anything, unsettled the Council. Most species fought with emotion, rage, pride, vengeance. Humans didn't. They treated war as a job. A task to be executed with precision, no matter how grim. Their soldiers didn't taunt or threaten. They didn't display trophies. They advanced, eliminated resistance, secured objectives, and moved on. Council delegates demanded an explanation. They wanted to know who authorized the engagement, where the chain of command was, how Earth justified unilateral intervention. The human representative, Commander Celine Reese, answered without apology. We did what needed to be done. Your people were dying. We were closest. That's the only logic required. When pressed further, she added, We've fought wars where command fell apart in the first hour. Our strength isn't in hierarchy, it's in response. Everyone's trained to take initiative. Waiting for orders gets you killed. That response shook the Council more than the victory itself. Other militaries relied on structure, delay, coordination. Humans relied on instinct refined through endless repetition. Initiative wasn't a privilege, it was a survival mechanism. For the core dominion, The defeat wasn't just military. It was ideological. They believed brute force was enough. That fear would paralyze opposition. Instead, they faced an enemy that didn't hesitate, didn't panic, and didn't stop until the threat was neutralized. What unnerved the Council further was the aftermath. Humanity didn't demand rewards. They didn't ask for political leverage. No territory, no reparations. They submitted an after-action report, offered medical assistance to surviving Council personnel, and resumed colonization as if nothing had happened. The absence of ambition was more alarming than if they'd claimed new systems. Council intelligence began re-evaluating Earth's military capabilities. Archived footage, doctrine simulations, war games, all previously underestimated. The deeper they looked, the more patterns emerged. Human combat didn't follow galactic norms. They incorporated redundancy, modular tactics, decentralized control. Each soldier was a node, not a cog. Field adaptability replaced rigid structure. They trained for worst-case scenarios, not just in theory, but in live exercises so brutal some were banned on other worlds. Their success wasn't luck. It was design. The Council had assumed Earth's low-key behavior meant inferiority. But it was the opposite. Humanity didn't advertise strength because they didn't need to. They didn't posture. They prepared. And now, that preparation had revealed something the Council wasn't ready to face. A new strategic model. One where fear wasn't used to dominate, but to predict, adapt, and survive. One where peace wasn't maintained by overwhelming force, but by individuals trained to become force incarnate when pushed. One where war wasn't glorified, but executed with such quiet finality that its message needed no anthem. The galaxy watched, and for the first time, reconsidered who among them truly understood conflict. Humanity didn't win because they wanted war. They won because they never forgot what it could cost if they lost. The Core Dominion's defeat changed everything, but the Council didn't want to admit it. On the surface, they praised the swift resolution and minimized the incident as an isolated escalation. Internally, panic spread. Quiet meetings turned into full-scale internal reviews. Military councils convened in secret. Species that had never fought a war in generations began re-examining their defense strategies. They hadn't just seen human warfare, they had seen its efficiency, its discipline, and its chilling calm. The most concerning detail wasn't the scale of the human response. It was how little effort it seemed to take. No experimental tech, no overwhelming numbers, no exotic weaponry. Just calculated movements, experienced decisions, and seamless execution. That meant something terrifying. If this was a restrained version, what would happen if humanity ever stopped holding back? Council intelligence rushed to uncover everything they had overlooked. New psychological profiles were compiled. Data analysts dug into centuries of Earth's military evolution. What they found dismantled centuries of assumptions. Human doctrines were not static. Each generation evolved their tactics based on previous mistakes. Entire military schools had been built not around victory, but around failure analysis. They didn't just learn from their own conflicts, they studied their enemies, allies, even theoretical threats that hadn't yet existed. This mindset didn't stop at the military. It was cultural. Human literature, philosophy, even entertainment emphasized growth through hardship. Their art spoke of struggle not as tragedy, but as fuel. Victory wasn't celebrated for dominance, it was respected for cost. The Council finally realized that Earth's caution wasn't diplomatic, it was preventative. Every peace initiative, every treaty, every delay in intervention wasn't weakness. It was control. Worse still, humans weren't dependent on centralized command. Authority could be shattered, and the machine would still run. Their units operated under decentralized mission frameworks. If command failed, someone else would pick it up without hesitation. That redundancy made them nearly impossible to cripple. The Corps learned it the hard way. They targeted human supply chains, assuming a traditional vulnerability. Instead, they found fallback caches, civilian transports converted into mobile resupply, and decentralized logistics that rerouted seamlessly. Human forces adjusted in real time. They didn't react, they recalculated. No species in the Council had such embedded adaptability. Others relied on doctrine. Humans relied on principles. The difference was subtle but fatal. Then came the political fallout. Certain factions within the Council wanted to sanction Earth. Not for the response, but for acting without permission. They feared the precedent. A colony taking military initiative without Council oversight threatened centralized authority. But the sanctions failed. Too many member worlds now questioned the Council's ability to protect them. Quiet support for Earth grew. Trade agreements increased. Independent alliances formed, unofficial but unmistakable. Humanity had proven not just capable, but dependable. Species that had long endured under the Council's bureaucracy now saw an alternative. One not interested in conquest or subjugation, but in decisive action. A quiet shift occurred. Human advisors were suddenly welcomed into military think tanks. Colonies began requesting Terran training programs. Civilian ships purchased defensive upgrades based on Earth designs. Tactical doctrines were rewritten with human adaptability in mind. The balance of power had begun to tilt. And Earth hadn't made a single demand. What disturbed Council leadership most was Earth's silence after the conflict. No public speeches. No declarations of strength. Just a series of standard reports, followed by more colonization, more research, more infrastructure. No celebration, no parade. This lack of bravado revealed something deeper. Earth had already assumed the responsibility that others feared to take. They didn't ask to lead. But when leadership was vacant, they filled it by default. Eventually, the Council requested a closed hearing with Earth's top military command. Not to reprimand, but to understand. The room wasn't filled with admirals or decorated officers. Instead, Earth sent analysts. Strategists. People who didn't command fleets but understood systems. One delegate asked a simple question. What is the core of your doctrine? The lead analyst, a woman named Dr. Lena Arendt, replied without hesitation. Minimize risk. Maximize survival. Win with precision. Finish quickly. Leave no room for escalation. Then rebuild better than before. When asked how they planned to scale this doctrine across the galaxy, her answer was even more unsettling. We don't. We hope it never becomes necessary. That humility sounded like fear to some, but others recognized it as warning. The Council was facing the truth it had tried to ignore. Earth was not waiting for power, it was preparing for necessity. Their systems weren't built for conquest, but for inevitability. Other species built armies to defend borders. Earth built systems to survive collapse. It explained everything. Why humans didn't rely on tradition. Why they questioned standard protocols. Why they insisted on adaptability over ceremony. They weren't trying to fit into the galaxy. They were preparing for the moment when the galaxy would break, and someone had to hold it together. It wasn't pride. It was pragmatism. And that realization split the Council. Some members wanted to draw closer to Earth. Learn from them. Integrate their systems. Others feared Earth's silent ascendancy and proposed containment policies. Earth responded the same way it always did: no threats, no ultimatums, no demands. Just clarity. We are not your rulers. We are not your saviors. But we will act when no one else will. And that promise, delivered without ego, carried more weight than any fleet ever could. From that moment forward, every galactic strategy included a new variable. Not a weapon. A warning. What happens when the quiet ones decide it's time to speak? The shift wasn't declared. It wasn't ratified or ceremonially acknowledged. But across the galaxy, reality changed. Humanity's presence no longer carried the quiet curiosity of a new entrant. Now, every movement was watched with sharpened awareness. Not with fear of invasion, but with the understanding that power, once hidden, had been seen. What lingered was not just respect, it was the recognition of potential that no longer needed validation. The core Dominion never recovered. Their command fractured, with splinter groups retreating into uncharted systems. Attempts to regroup failed under the pressure of internal dissent and external containment. Ironically, it wasn't Council fleets that finalized their collapse, it was systems aligned with Earth through informal cooperation. Small colonies, minor species, scattered civil unions that had never before asserted strength now found themselves empowered by association. They adopted Earth's methodologies, restructured their defenses, and acted decisively. They didn't mimic humans. They learned from them. Earth never built an empire. It didn't need one. Influence seeped into the void left by indecision and doubt. Not by force, but by example. Every time Earth stepped forward, it did so without ceremony, yet with undeniable intent. Council analysts called it the doctrine of silent gravity, a force that pulled others not through demand, but through inevitability. Back on Earth, nothing visibly changed. No great monuments were built. No new anthem echoed through the stars. The military remained modest by galactic standards, with fleets proportionate to defensive needs. But inside training academies, the curriculum evolved. Simulations no longer focused on Earth-centric scenarios. Cadets studied alien cultures, nonlinear conflict, and interspecies crisis diplomacy. It wasn't expansion, it was foresight. Diplomatic channels that had once ignored Terran input now deferred to it. Not because Earth had claimed superiority, but because their track record now spoke louder than any title. When disputes erupted in outer systems, territorial disagreements, trade disputes, border threats, Earth was often requested as a neutral mediator. Their reputation for action had been matched by an equally formidable reputation for restraint. This duality confused traditional Council strategists. Historically, power and aggression were intertwined. Strength implied desire for dominance. But Earth rejected that equation. They taught that strength without wisdom was just noise, and restraint without capability was merely hope. It wasn't long before smaller worlds sought integration with Terran networks. Not political annexation, but strategic alignment. Shared intelligence. Co-training agreements. Disaster response collaborations. Human advisors embedded themselves in foreign militaries not as commanders, but as system architects. They taught others how to decentralize without losing control, how to prepare for chaos without breeding fear, how to build resilience instead of dependence. And the ones who listened became stronger. Not all welcomed this change. On several core Council worlds, political factions warned of cultural contamination. They feared that by adopting Terran philosophy, traditional values would erode. They painted humans as architects of a quiet coup, one that replaced protocol with pragmatism, ceremony with consequence. But despite these objections, no alternate model proved as effective. Every time a crisis arose, the question echoed. What would Earth do? Over time, even language shifted. Terms like Terran resolve and the human equation entered common vocabulary. Entire courses were designed around Earth's response models. And still, Earth never demanded recognition. It simply operated. This humility wasn't a facade. It was memory. Earth didn't forget its own history. Leaders frequently reminded their people, and their allies, that every strength humanity possessed was forged in failure. They weren't exceptional by nature. They were refined by necessity. That distinction mattered. When Earth was asked to formally lead a new strategic division of the Council, they declined the chair but accepted the responsibility. Their representative said, "We'll guide, but we won't govern. You don't need rulers. You need resilience." And that became the quiet doctrine that spread across the stars. Children on distant planets learned Earth's wartime stories not as tales of conquest, but of survival. Soldiers trained in hybrid academies carried Terran methods into unfamiliar terrain. Entire sectors once ruled by slow politics began moving faster, more efficiently, grounded in action and recovery. The galaxy wasn't becoming Terran, it was becoming durable. The Council, now evolving under internal pressure, began restructuring. Command centralization weakened in favor of regional autonomy, coordinated through new interspecies alliances modeled after Earth's redundant frameworks. Crisis response teams were no longer bound by endless voting delays. Action replaced discussion. Evaluation followed, not preceded. Humanity remained at the edge of every major change. Never demanding credit, never claiming ownership. But the fingerprint was always there. What had begun as a perception of weakness had become the template for strength. The greatest irony was that humanity had never asked for this outcome. They didn't seek to lead, to dominate, or to influence. They only wanted to ensure that when the next war came, and everyone knew it would not catch them unprepared. And that mindset, more than any fleet or weapon, transformed the galaxy. By the end of the cycle, when historians recorded the shift, they didn't mark it with a battle or a treaty. They marked it with a phrase. The moment the galaxy stopped underestimating Earth,